Boom. Welcome back to the Context Coaching Podcast. We are joined today by my colleague and recent section champion soccer coach, Toby Elmore. Thanks for being here today.
My pleasure.
Well, shoot, let's dive right in then, Coach. Take us through your background. How did we end up coaching high school soccer, doing what you're doing now? Take us through the journey. What was your first job in the process of moving beyond those to where you are now?
So I guess everything began kind of in early elementary school where for whatever reason in spite of the fact that very few people around me played soccer, I just absolutely fell in love with the game. And that I bring that up just because that's driven my passion for the sport and my passion for coaching since the start. So I've always wanted to surround myself with the game, and whether that's in the context of watching, playing, or helping others play, that's been a central part of my life. I had the left side of the bench on lock throughout college. It was all mine. And was told unequivocally by the coach that I was never going to see any playing time. And I didn't care because I got to go every day and be out around the game. I got to travel to games. I got to think about the game. I got to listen to my college coach talk about the game. And I wasn't going to let that obstacle throw me off what I saw as a path connected to the game. So my first job out of college I was an intern at the high school I went to, and was immediately thrust into an assistant coaching position there for the varsity team. Had a blast, loved it, and apparently was competent enough to be named head coach after my intern year at St. Andrew's Sewanee School for both the boys and the girls programs. And girls played in the fall and boys played in the spring, so I was able to coach both those teams. And really, kind of had the opportunity to better understand what it meant to really head a team, build culture, think about training. The location wasn't ideal and wasn't a great fit. So I left after a year, but found myself in youth coaching after I moved to Seattle. And then after 2 short years trying not to teach, I landed back at the Dunn School in Los Olivos, where I again was named, head coach of their varsity boys program. Was there for 2 years, and have been essentially a head coach ever since. As I, navigated from Dunn to Thatcher to Hotchkiss, and then now to Stevenson. And so I've loved being a head coach. There's a part of me that would love to be an assistant coach as well, as much to learn from somebody else and to be, in a position to be in a supportive role. At the same time, it is one of those things that I am truly passionate about and love.
Great. Thanks for that background information. And listening to that, it would appear that this has been your longest stop. Is that accurate?
It has. Yes. I was at Thatcher for 7 years, and so that was the longest before then. But yes, this is now the longest.
Love it. It gives us a little bit of fodder for some of the things I want to ask. But before I do so, I want to go all the way back to the first job. And I'm going to spin this a little bit so you can talk about it in regards to the transition at each of the places as you moved along this journey. Mm-hmm. What did you realize right away when you were named the head coach that you needed to figure out? You were coached up. You got to have all these conversations with your head coach at college because you spent so much time next to him on the bench.
So much time.
And you think you're ready, but you're really not. None of us are. We're never ready. So what did you learn right away that you need to figure out? And then as you transition from place to place, right, we always think like we're figuring this thing out and we got the scheme, and then, well, this is a different place. Talk a little bit about that.
Yeah. No, there was a significant learning curve. In that the girls team I had that first year as a head coach, they were a very talented team, actually, in that they had a number of seniors, a number of experienced players, um, and my challenge was to understand kind of the intersection between their playing experience, their the experience they'd had with their previous coach, and what they were looking for in terms of culture and practice, and like what, because it's one thing to say, well, I have what I do and I'm just going to do that regardless. I'm not. I, I don't. I don't that's never a way I'm going to enter into a space, right? I wanted to first, as well as I could, understand the school, understand the kids, understand the program and the history of the program, what they value, what they wanted out of it, and so I did what I could to really, I spent a lot of time off the field with the captains, with the players, having them over to my apartment to get together and socialize, and just trying to build like a culture of positivity around the program. I wanted the team to be something that they enjoyed, and a place that they felt like they belonged and could contribute, um, simultaneously, and this was the tough part, um, begin to set some expectations for what it means to compete. Because we're going up against, like, again, I don't know if you're familiar at all with some of those Tennessee schools, but we were playing like Battleground Academy and Girls Preparatory School and Harpeth Hall, and these, like, I mean, these are good teams, and we're this, I hesitate to say it, but like small, very small. I'm not going to use, well, anyway, um, we were a scrappy team, and we were a scrappy school. And so figuring out, okay, so I'm never going to go in and just assume that we're going to get our butts kicked. What can we do to compete at this level? Uh, and there were some serious missteps there. Things like I vividly remember an early game in which my girls wouldn't head the ball. Like, there are these, like, goal kicks or punts from the opposing team. My girls were just ducking out of the way, and so my solution to that was to line them up on the half line, and I was just cranking balls up in the air. And if they didn't head the ball, they had to sprint to me and sprint back. That did not go well. There it ended up with tears, bloody noses, a black eye, and it accomplished none of what I hoped it would accomplish. Um, so there were missteps like that, like all along the way. Recognizing that, like, yes, this girl is the best player on the team, and if I play her every minute of every game, her body's going to break down, which it did, and that was on me. But one of those things where that has come with experience. That in the moment, I just figured, well, in college, like, you always kept the best players on the team on the field the whole game. But this is different, right? It's a different game, different bodies, different levels of physical acumen. So, yeah, there were a lot of lessons learned. But I loved it. I had fun. I appreciated the challenge. And in the end, I saw it, in spite of the fact that we got our butts kicked significantly. And we had a couple of close games, few wins. But the girls had fun, and they competed. They were both bummed when we lost, and I had them thinking about what could have gone better, what they could have done better. And for me, that's the most important thing, is that they're thinking about the game, thinking about how to get better. I the outreach that I did after the season, I got two kids. There was no club presence in Sewanee, Tennessee, and so I took these two girls to a ODP tryout. They made the team. Both of them went on to play at the next level. And both of them later shared with me that my being willing to sort of go that extra step to offer them that opportunity gave them the confidence that, you know what, I can do this, and I'm going to do this.
And from there, as you navigated the next few phases of your journey, what would you say is one thing that you had to figure out? Not necessarily to each place, but things that have set with you throughout the entirety of your career. Like these are the things
Yeah,
that, like, no matter where you're at, like you got to get these ducks in a row.
yeah. Um, I think culture is probably the most important thing. In that, with the exception of Hotchkiss, I've never stepped into a program that was, like, prior to my arrival, excellent, right? Um, it was somewhere between like bad to middling, um, and recognizing that to build a program up, that process needs to begin with developing a culture of growth, right? And it's a mindset and a practice, that needs to be tended to every day in season, and in the off season as well. Like it just, it can't be something that's neglected. So that was a really big thing for me, and that shifted. Like when I was at Dunn, um, what that looked like was fitness, right? Like I told those boys, like, we are going to be the most fit team we play, and I ran them into the ground, and I ran with them, to the point where they made me a shirt at the end of the season. Um, well, they made themselves shirts that said "I survived, Coach Elmore," and then they made one for me. They crossed out the "survived" and wrote M. But they were proud of this, right? And uh, Dunn, that was not necessarily a culture that was pervasive at Dunn at that time. And so it was kind of a marker of, like, this is who we are. We're strong. And then similar, thing at Thatcher, like that with that girls team there, building that culture right from the start, and they were amenable to it. They worked incredibly hard. They believed in themselves. They believed in one another. And it wasn't necessarily about winning and losing, but that but they wanted to do that. Like, they wanted to win, but they wanted to win for each other, which is one of the reasons why it was why Hotchkiss was so challenging, is that there was a pretty strong embedded culture when I got there, and I felt like I had to mold myself to that culture, and it wasn't me, and it wasn't what I believed in, and that made it really challenging.
Well, let's talk about that for a second in regards to coaching in general, teaching in general. When you are arriving at a place, or hell, you've been at a place and you're taking over an existing program, like the shift I made this year when I, switched
Hmm.
to the girls in regards to um, how do you find that balance, right? Because I don't think necessarily the answer is ever, it has to be all my way or it has to be the way that it's already set up, right? It's like, how do you get the lay of the land and adjust while being authentic to
Yes.
the place you're at, right? Like I joked, and you and I have talked about this. Like when I first got back here, from a coaching standpoint, I didn't, in hindsight, I don't feel I was a mission appropriate fit coming from where I came coaching wise. But I have learned what works here and what doesn't, and how to embrace that. And so talk a little bit about that and that process for figuring that out.
Yeah. I I mean, what I figured out through that Hotchkiss experience, and I didn't figure it out at Hotchkiss. I figured it out afterwards. Is that I needed to identify sort of my own core values and, like, what are my non-negotiables, um, and then what is the culture of the place, and what is the pre-existing culture of the team. in hindsight, if I could go back, I would have done things a lot differently at Hotchkiss. Um, and I'm okay with that now because it's very much informed how I approached my entry into this place, into Stevenson, um, which is that I sort of molded the high expectations and like the training methods and the approaches that I had to develop when I was at Hotchkiss, given the very high level of play there, while also holding on to the relational piece that I didn't have there, and there were outside forces that complicated that significantly, that were outside of my control. But there was certainly more I could have done to exercise greater agency while I was there, that I applied to the program at Stevenson when I got here. And I think to good effect. Like I think the reality is, I think where I am now. I feel very comfortable about what it takes to get a team training at a high level, and playing at a high level without screaming at each other and without being at each other's throats, and without having that be the motivating factor, which in a lot of places it is, right. And that coaches actually kind of manipulate that and use that to like create the sort of energy and intensity and focus. That's not me. I'm a firm believer that you can get a group of student athletes to believe in themselves and believe in one another, and use that as fodder for motivation and to push forward what they do. So that's been a huge takeaway for me. And I've had some conversations with a couple of the former players from Hotchkiss, and it's been interesting to hear their anecdotes about what it was like to be with me during that time, and it's clear that that's not me. That's not me.
Well, regardless of if it was or not, those conversations are always enjoyable at this point in our experience slash age. When
Yes.
you talk to the players from well before, and they tell you how you're soft now and all these other things that aren't exactly true, but that's how they see it. So anyway, moving on. I want a short version of this because I know you can go into the weeds, and I don't want that because it's too complicated for my brain and therefore the majority of the world probably, but not yours. But the whole soccer licensure degree
Yeah.
program, uh,
Yeah.
it doesn't exist in basketball or most other sports. So just give a quick rundown about like how that whole thing works, what it's like, so people that are listening that aren't soccer people but may be interested in figuring out a way to get some I don't want to say real, but some documented professional development
Yeah.
rather than just, well, I worked for Jimmy for 15 years, so I learned X.
Yeah. Yeah. No, it's a great question, and I would credit that work with my progress as a coach. I mean, arguably more than anything else. And there are two primary diploma programs. One is through the United States Soccer Federation. I did not do that program. That is a wildly complicated program. It's so many different levels. It's like you need a completely separate degree to even understand what the different diplomas are. I went through the what was then called the National Soccer Coaches Association of America. It's now called United Soccer Coaches. And I really appreciated their approach is grounded in, it's grounded in education, not telling you, yes, you are qualified or not qualified. It's about, and what that looks like is that, so the process I went through, I got my national diploma, my advanced national diploma, and then my premier diploma. Advanced diploma begins with training the individual. And so the course itself is designed solely around like, how do you train the individual player? What does that look like? What are the different facets of the game that need to be trained? And arguably the most valuable piece of the entire diploma program is that in the end, in order to receive your, in this case, national diploma, you have to run a session. And you are assessed and evaluated by licensed college coaches who then talk through, here are the strengths of what you did, here are the weaknesses of what you did. And there's a dialogue there that's missing from a lot of, from my understanding, a lot of the other diploma programs. From the national diploma to the advanced national diploma, then they start talking about like lines, right? So from the individual player, now you're looking at now you're training the defensive line or the midfield line or the forward line. Same process. Different objectives, very clear objectives. My dad, who was a longtime professor of education, actually like took my national diploma book because he was like, this is brilliant. Like from an educational standpoint, the way they've laid out very clearly the objectives, the sentence stems, the models for how to do it, exemplars. Like, I mean, it was just a remarkable teaching tool. And then ultimately, as in all of the different programs, you then you're assessed and evaluated on, can you do it, right? And I used to be a really quiet, soft-spoken coach until my national diploma, where the guy was like, dude, I don't know what you're saying. Like, I can't hear you. Like, elevate your voice. Like, and now, I feel bad because I think I dominate the whole field space up there when I start coaching and talking. I know because some coaches have commented on it. But that's something I learned, right? And it's something I applied, and I think it's something that helps, right? That coaching voice. And then, with the Premier Diploma, like far and away the hardest. I was the only high school coach in there. The rest were college coaches who were in that program. Very challenging, very high expectations. Coach from the University of Cincinnati was my, sort of supervisor. And he and I had some really hard conversations at the end about what went well, what didn't. What he would have done differently. He wanted me to reflect on what I would have done differently. And there's ongoing work throughout the week. It's a 5-day residential program with programming from 8 a.m. to 7 p.m. And then homework overnight. So it's all encompassing for a short period of time, which is incredibly valuable. Like, how often do you get to just immerse yourself in thinking about that in community with other coaches doing the same thing? So I credit that with where I am as a coach today, as much as like all of the aggregated experience I've had up to this point.
Yeah, it's always fascinated me. I remember when you first got here and we would talk about it, and I'd be like, "You're doing what? Like, what? That doesn't even exist." And so it's great. And I would imagine anybody that's listening that's not a anyone that's a soccer person, you should definitely look into that. Anybody that's not, there is a version of that experience that can be had, even if you are just bringing your local coaches into the gym to observe you and give you feedback, right? That's the hack to what Coach just talked about. Any other suggestions?
No, I think the feedback part, well, the sort of guided direction, right, of being assigned, you will train, right, the number 6 to attack wide areas or to find wide areas, right? That's your task for your final exam, right? So then thinking about, oh wow, like that's a really specific small thing. How do I then build that out? Like, what are the skills, the individual technical skills? What are the sort of small scale collective tactical skills? And then how do I work that? How do I build up, right? How do I create a session that begins with those core technical skills that are needed in order to execute that move or to execute that play? And then what is the tactical movement and the tactical thinking and communication that enables a larger group to be able to carry that out. So thinking through those processes rather than I'm going to do drill A and then I'm going to do drill B and then I'm going to do drill C, which is fine. And that's how I coached for a significant chunk of my career. But this like just totally transformed. But then without a doubt, the most important thing is getting what in the education world we call a MKO, right? A more knowledgeable other to to observe, right? And to say, yeah, okay, there were some strengths here, A, B, and C. Here's some things I would have done differently, X, Y, Z. What do you think? Like, what were your thoughts? What were your impressions? And then so the feedback and then reflection loop that, for those of us in education, we know is critical to, building and developing and enhancing any practice.
Yeah, and I think what I've learned after 25 years of this, which I'm sure you have as well, and you can describe it and articulate it in a much more specific way, just even based on the diploma program and what you said, is when you're early in career, you are stringing a bunch of drills together because, oh, I saw this,
Mm-hmm.
I saw this, but very rarely are you actually thinking about, does this actually fit what I'm trying to teach? And,
Yes.
reverse engineering from what you're trying to accomplish to whatever, I don't even like to call them drills anymore, whatever activities you're doing, right? Whatever games you're playing to teach what you're trying to accomplish. And I think that's where, if you're still at the implement drill phase because you saw a cool drill, at a minimum, I would invite you to ask yourself, how is this applying to what I'm trying to teach holistically, tactically about the game?
Right. Right. No, and I mean that from like midway through my coaching tenure at Thatcher, through Hotchkiss, that's been like the defining shift is it begins with, okay, what is the system of play? What are the roles and responsibilities of the different players on the field? And how can I train them to execute the technical and the tactical elements needed in order to do what we want to do within that system of play, and to not be wed to a particular system of play because I'm that guy, but rather, okay, with who I have, like, what is it, right? What do we have here? Stevenson 8 years ago, I was dealing with a very different system of play than I am now. And so, the way that I train them has to be different, right? And what we do on a daily basis has to be different. Greater emphasis, like back then, it was much greater emphasis on individual technical work because they weren't as progressed as the players I have now. So I got to remediate for that. Got to simplify, right? Like, they did not have, back 8 years ago, they did not have the tactical understanding of the game. Whereas, kids arrive now, they've got a much better understanding of systems of play and what that means. And so, but organizing training sessions around that has become critically important for me.
So another curiosity I have in regards to soccer is, why do y'all call it training and not practice?
It's a really good question. It's a really good question. The answer to which I'm not exactly sure. I think the idea is and actually, now that I'm thinking about it, I do remember asking this question at my premier diploma program, which was down at Westmont. Gosh, I mean, it was when Kelly was still the AD, so I don't know how long ago that was, but and what what the Brits told me is that practice actually refers to something else, right? It's like it's a thing that's done, right? Whereas training, you're the word itself, has sort of infers a different meaning, right? Which is there is a particular thing, a specific thing that you are training, right? Not necessarily that you're practicing, right? Because, you know, training kind of implies that there is a level of development that is going to result in kind of a differentiated approach given the different skill levels and all that. Whereas practice, again, in my mind, like I've been calling the training now for like 9 years of the 25 years that I've been coaching. So it's relatively new, and I've kind of followed the kids call it training. So I'm like, all right, whatever. But for me, like actually, it's tomato tomato. But I do kind of see some of the distinction that at least the Europeans why they value training over practice.
Fair answer. I appreciate that. It's always been an internal running joke with me because you can't say
Yes, I get
you're
it.
talking about
I get
practice.
it.
You're talking about training. Anyway, we'll get away
Training.
from that.
Talk about
Okay.
training.
What do you think at this point, Coach, is the best thing you do in your program and that has the largest ripple effect on culture? And I don't want to talk about culture; it's a buzzword, but what are some things that are very specific to what you do that you think impacts culture in the way in which you have come to understand it? That were you to leave and go coach elsewhere, this is definitely coming with me because it's that transformational.
Yeah, that's a great question. I guess I would answer it twofold. And the first is super simple and sounds silly, but um, I had the kids over to my house a lot. Um, and
Can I interrupt this really quickly? Because for people that aren't familiar with our type of schools, you made a comment earlier that you had the kids when you were coaching the girls team to your apartment a lot. We work at boarding schools, people, and ultimately we live on campus. And so having the kids over to the house who live in the residential community is a very normal thing. And it helps them find a sense of balance and home when they are living away from their families. All right, back to your answer.
an important distinction. And I now recognize how potentially problematic that sounded earlier. So yes, I was living on campus. And even now, like when I think about those teams that have really been cohesive, right, and worked well together and believed in one another and believed in themselves, a lot of that stuff happens informally off the pitch, like um, away from training, away from games, and happens in a fun sort of manner. Like for me, the most important thing, I guess, is that the kids find time to laugh, right? And the kids find time to smile and have fun with one another outside the context of the sport itself. I believe that then trickles into their performances, right, and their approach to the game itself, and that so that's one piece. And it seems trivial, but like it's impactful. It's significantly impactful. And whether that is just the 10 or 12 times I may have them over to the house during the course of the season, to our trip up to San Francisco or down to Santa Barbara, like those moments really mean something. Like the kids talked about our San Francisco trip all season long. And every time they did, it brought a smile to their face. They laughed. They laughed about the yoga we did. They laughed about, I mean, and those moments of positivity, very much, I believe, sort of fuel that sense of intrinsic motivation to perform for one another, right? So it's really intrinsic in that way, and community based in a way that it, sadly, I think so much of soccer in particular, particularly like the club, like the cutthroat club thing, is just like it's not about that. And I think that's probably true with most cutthroat club sports, right? It's not about team bonding and all that. It's about results. Um, I think the other leadership, like student leadership, and having not just loud voices, but voices loud voices are needed sometimes, but also voices that are comforting and caring on the part of captains, right? So that these players actually really truly believe that the captains care about them, and they're going to be much more open to going to them to talk about whatever issues may be arising. Um, and I think most importantly, captains who put their money where their mouth is, and train harder than anybody else, um, who lift up one another more than anybody else, and so who establish those norms and those practices that we want everybody to do. So it makes it much easier for me to have a conversation with a player who's perhaps not putting in the effort, to say, like, look, your captains are exemplars, and they are the models. And so, talk to them. Let's watch them. Let's think about how they approach training, and, hold a mirror up and ask yourself, like, is that how I'm approaching this as well? So those two things for me, at least, particularly of late, have been critically important. Um,
No, I like that answer. I mean, it's two very specific things that I think both have merit. The number one, summarizing the informal time spent together does more for your culture than the time you spend on the pitch, not the field against soccer. But we and I agree. I mean, the time in advance, right? The
yeah.
roadie isn't as much as going and playing and getting some great win or whatever. It's about being in the van. It's about being in a hotel. It's about being at the Chick-fil-A after the game, whatever it happens to be, right? And I think a lot of times those things are missed. And your comment about the way it is on the club side of things, it's I think there's a certain aspect of that you can't get around at the club level, right? Because you're not
Mm-hmm.
it's transactional. You're showing up to use one another to get whatever you're trying to get out of it, right? And then there's some clubs that actually try, like Jason Heeb does a good job here with Seaside's Finest, really trying to put those activities in to build that culture within the club while you have those kids, right? But you're really melding a bunch of kids from different schools together. And then that other piece that you mentioned in regards to how do you use your leaders, whether you deem them captains or not, as your exemplars, right? As the way to message certain things, as the way to temper some of those conversations that may be hard. I think that's a great answer on both of those things. And then I would invite as a follow-up, while you have established those things within your own program, what have you learned watching other programs? And if possible, I'm actually curious what you've learned watching not soccer, but other sports. I
Yeah.
think we're in this age, and you know how you and I have these talks about this of sport specialization, which I think is destroying the world. But ultimately, I think that there are ways that us as coaches and our athletes are developed by learning to be multifaceted, by taking bits and pieces from every coach they come across, every sport they play. But I'm also curious, like from your standpoint, I know you coached lacrosse for a while here, but it's also ultimately it's like, hey, what are you picking up? Listening to Wendy coach tennis, because you can hear her up at the field. What do you, what do
Yes, you
you,
can.
yeah, right? What are you learning, from anything else that you're coming across? And I only ask this, Toby, because I don't think enough of us think outside the box this way, right? And it's like
Yeah.
I can learn to coach by watching a discipline that is not my own.
Yeah. Yeah. Um, no, I think that's a really good question. And I, in watching basketball, um, I I found myself in the games I watched this season. Um, it was interesting, like thinking about the role of, like, the sort of differentiated roles of positioning and movement, right? What does that look like in basketball? And then, like, what is the analog in soccer, right? Like why, like when, when a system in basketball works, right? And you can see when it works, right? There's almost like, I mean, it's almost like it's choreographed, right? I mean, it's a dance basically in terms of, players moving within a defined space. And if they're, to when it's done really well, right? It's unconscious, right? Um, and just thinking about like, oh my gosh, like the the amount of time and effort and energy devoted to understanding that movement and the two or three options that are available every time that ball moves from one spot to the next, that players need to be like unconsciously aware of, almost, right? Not even like consciously aware, but there's that like next level of awareness that I find fascinating, right? Because it's in such a concentrated space. It actually weirdly reminds me of I coached squash for a while. I played squash in college and coached squash for a little bit. And it's actually very similar, right? With each stroke, with each hit, the placement of the ball is is fundamentally like it's going to determine what your opponent can do with it, right? Um, so how tight it is to the wall, how close it is to the side walls, how close it is to the front wall, like that is going to dictate and determine what your opponent can do with the ball. And thus you need to, because there's not enough time after they hit it to get to it. So you need to really anticipate, right? Body shape, movement towards the ball, what's their approach to the ball, right? And you have to start like not guessing necessarily, but anticipating, right? Which, I see as actually something very similar to basketball, right? In that you're anticipating the movement of the defense, right? You're anticipating the movement of your teammates and how they're going to react and respond to the movement of the defense. So then thinking about, like, for me, then thinking about like, oh man, what does that look like as we're building from the back line through the midfield line? To what degree am I really helping my forward line understand the impact of how those shifts that occur as we're trying to build out impact the space that they should be moving into. So I think there's like really super strong correlations between that are interesting that I actually found myself thinking of quite a bit this season, particularly um, watching hoops up here. It was even more pronounced, I think, just because the level is so ridiculously high. And they play with each other all year. So,
No, I think that's a great answer. And I think that my sports specialization soapbox, I'm on. I think the more people can understand that, like, they all
yeah,
benefit, they all complement one another.
yeah,
And whether it's tennis, right? Whether it's, in your case, squash, whether it's softball to basketball, there's always something that can be gleaned, even if it's just an approach and a way in which vocabulary matters, like that you're hearing a certain
yeah,
coach do, right? So I
yeah,
think that's always
yeah.
an interesting way to think about sports.
And
All
just to piggyback on one thing I mentioned before, like the authenticity piece as it pertains to, when I was talking about having the kids over and like developing that rapport and the fun and all that. I find myself like there were several moments this season where or when I would pull a team in at halftime or something like that, and maybe we're down, like, we went down a bunch in the NorCal tournament, and just pulling the boys in and be like, everybody, smile, like, and I would look at them and I would smile and I would make them all smile, right? And there is a documented psychological effect of that, right? And if I don't, if that comes across as inauthentic, it doesn't have the impact it has, right? If I haven't built the credibility and like established that as something that I actually do value, they're going to look at me like I'm from another planet. Um, but doing that and having them trust me that, like, Yeah, like that really is something that matters a lot to me. In those moments, you're able to kind of break through a lot of the silliness that in particular adolescents, but also adults can get hung up on, and that can fundamentally impede their performance.
No doubt. And I think as we were going through that, and what I loved about your run through the playoffs this year, in addition to you finding a tremendous amount of success, is that it was the first time in 7 years like I've had a chance to actually watch games, right? Because our
Mhm.
seasons are in run into each other, and so it was so much fun being out there. But it was also the same thing that you were echoing that I said to you a couple times, and I reminded the boys a couple times. It's like, yo, have some fun out here. Like
Yeah,
playing with house money. Like,
yeah.
no one
We
expects you to
weren't
be
supposed to
here.
be here.
Yeah. So it's like, smile, go out there, have a good time. Who cares? So I think that's a great reminder. Even when you're not playing without house money, it's like with house money, it's if you're not having fun, like what's the point? And I think that's what selfishly I was able to experience the last 2 years with like Trent Toole on my team, right? Because as
Mm,
good as he was, it was all about competing and having a good time, right? And it was like one of those things that if you can embed that into your culture and you are truly having fun, regardless of outcome, like the journey is just so much better. And we weren't great outcome wise on the girls side this year, but we got the culture right and the kids were having fun and they didn't want the season to
yeah.
end, even though we weren't very good. And so I think that's a great teachable that you just offered up. I'm gonna give you two more and I'm gonna let you get some rest after your long few days of WASC fun. Um, what would you say you have most recently changed your mind on? And I know you're a deep thinker, you're getting a PhD. I don't remember what it's in. You can explain that as you answer this question, but it's more of a growth mindset question, right? Where we get dug in and then it's hard to change our mind on something and sometimes never. But at the end of the day, I'm always curious where it's like, you know what, I used to be over here pretty deep, and now I'm over here, and here's why. And it doesn't have to be soccer related, Toby. It could be about anything. Because really it's about how are we constantly challenging our beliefs?
Yeah. So something I've been thinking a lot about, and that I've definitely I've changed my mind pretty significantly on, actually has to do with analytical writing. Weirdly enough, um, and in particular,
This is what you get when you're dealing with a PhD candidate, people.
um, so it, um, and it's actually related to my dissertation is related to teacher perceptions of student engagement and their impact on instructional practices, right? So I have these two theoretical frameworks that I are the lenses through which I'm running all my information, and one of them is called self-determination theory. And self-determination theory posits that intrinsic motivation, which is what we're really hoping to build within, whether it's our students or our athletes or whatever, um, is augmented when students or players or whoever feel a sense of competence, relatedness, and autonomy, right? So when that sort of perfect combination of things comes about, um, the theory posits that intrinsic motivation is more likely to develop. So I've started thinking about that in the context of like the analytical writing assignments I make, and I've ended up just feeling bad about my focus on structure and the role that structure has played uh, in my attempts to try and develop writers, and that I've come to recognize that while I thought what I was doing was making things easier, what I was actually doing was telling students, I know what's best, do this exact thing, and then you'll get a cookie at the end, which is an A, right? Or but I mean, it's something along the lines of, here, follow this very strict, like, I'm not going to trust you in the least bit, right? To think about how you might be able to convey an argument, to convey an idea, to present historical evidence or anything in that regard. I'm just going to tell you, do it this way, right? And if you do it this way, then you'll get a good grade. If you do it any other way, then you won't get a good grade. And I don't yet know exactly how to how else to do it and what that might look like, but I think there are implications beyond just analytical essay writing as well, right? I mean, I think it speaks to this notion of, like, to what degree am I actually stripping away a student's autonomy, right? And their sense of autonomy by telling them, no, you need to do this like exactly this way. And it absolutely impacts this notion of competence, right? Because what if they don't want to do it that way, right? Then essentially the message that's being sent is you're not competent because you aren't willing and you don't think that this way is the best way to do it. So I'm still, like, sort of working through what that means for my practice, but that's very much something, as I just graded a collection of 18 essays, something that's very much present on my mind.
Well, I'll tell you, it transfers directly to coaching as well, because everything you just mentioned, right? Competence, relationality. I forget what word you use in autonomy. What was the middle word?
Relatedness.
Relatedness. Okay. But point being, right? If you want athletes to do something, they need to be competent at it, which is then give them confidence, right? To relate it to whatever you're asking them to do tactically, right? And then ultimately, this idea of autonomy, like, as you gain competence, you're going to get more autonomy, right? And that's why ultimately, as we've coached athletes over the years, it's like, yo, hey, why does Mikey get to do that and I don't? I'm like, because he's better than you. And when you can prove that you can do this, you will be able to do more things. In the meantime, here are the things you can do within the structure that we have created for you.
Yeah. No, I mean, it's like, I mean, my midfield three, I don't care what they do because I trust them to do whatever it is that they do, right? And I will correct them when they're off. And then there are other players who are given very strict instructions, right? You know, so-and-so, what I want you to do when you go in right now, like, you're going to be up and down the line, up and down the line, up and down the line. You're going to work harder than anybody else on the field for the next 10 minutes, and then I'm going to pull you off. In the effort, because then the next day in training, okay, right, how do I get that player to the next level, right, to build their competence, so that they can be more autonomous players, and have more freedom out there, to be able to engage in the game in a freer sense than what I view as their current limitations in terms of their ability.
No doubt. And that's always the challenge, right? How do we help them become as great as they can while working them within the system based on the skill set they currently have? So fascinating thing to have changed your mind on, and I like that. All right, let's wrap with this. And this may be a doozy. You might not have an answer, so I'm going to give you two. What is an insult you've received that you're most proud of, or what's the best compliment you've ever received? So I'll give you both. You take either option, or you can answer both.
The insult one.
You know that one, it's kind of like
People
someone trying to insult you, and you're like, actually, you know what? I'm proud of that.
Yeah. People are too nice in education, so I just actually haven't been insulted much at all lately. I think, and it might be just like proximity. I mean, this is the most proximate thing that actually has happened to me, but it speaks to something that we've talked about, on a couple of occasions, and it actually matters a lot to me. This accreditation visit that I just completed, at the end of it, very challenging high school, and the principal came up to me afterwards, and was grateful and thanked me and the other members of the committee for the work that we did, But then she said she was like, "You're so nice." She was like, "We all expected something very different, but you were so nice." Um, and for me, what that reinforced is that I mean, the power of kindness, right? I mean, we delivered some
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 bad news.
challenging some findings, not bad news, but just some challenging findings, right? Like some really difficult stuff to this school, and they received it in a way that I think was significantly um, augmented by the fact that throughout the whole process we communicated that we saw the challenges they faced. We greeted them with a smile. We greeted them kindly every day. We thanked them throughout the process for every focus group discussion, every time we observed a class, all that. Like, and in with the divisive political rhetoric today, there's not a lot of kindness in the world, right? There's a lot of not kindness, and even if you're trying to do really difficult things and have really difficult conversations with people, um, doing so and beginning from a place of kindness and generosity, I think could go a really long way. And so I was just like, oh wow, like thank you. This is like, again, what the message we delivered was not sunshine and rainbows, right? And there's a heck of a lot of work that they're going to have to do moving forward, but they seem genuinely grateful for the way in which we approached the whole process. And I think there's something to that.
Yeah, no, I love that answer, and especially knowing what it is you were doing. And most people that are listening to this that are in education will understand what a WASC visit is, but it's how your school maintains its accreditation, and you get feedback. I guess almost like a coaching evaluation, right? It's like, hey, these are the things you need to get better at. These are the things you're doing really well, and you have 3 years to show us progress on this, or 6, or whatever it happens to be. So,
Yes.
yeah, that's a great take, and I love that. Well, I appreciate you taking the time, Coach. I know you're probably exhausted after the nights you have spent writing all of these analytical reports. And for those of you listening, I made a comment to him when we first got on the call about how I love the fact that he nerds out on this stuff, because don't want to touch that stuff with a 10-foot pole. Just tell us what we
I do
need to
love
do.
it.
Anyway, so get back to your life. Appreciate you jumping on.
Of course, my pleasure. Take care, Justin.